My guest today is Pol Antràs. Pol is a professor of economics at Harvard University. He's a renowned international trade economist. His most recent work has focused on the analysis of global value chains and on the interplay between trade, inequality, and redistribution.
We've been writing and thinking a lot about it, and we've been all kind of worrying with the Trump administration, which wasn't really such a huge change over the previous one, probably in this way, the sense that we have entered a new phase in the era of international relationship of trade that basically means that trade is not growing as much as it was, that it's slowing down, or even the trend towards globalization is reversing. What do the data tell us, and what's your sense about what's going on?
Yeah, so I think my sense is that the case for a slowdown in globalization, what the economist has called the slowbalization process, I think the case is very clear. That is, if you look at various measures of globalization, they grew incredibly fast in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And then the Great Recession came and they kind of stagnated. There's some exceptions. Migration is at an all-time high. You might debate whether, refugees are part of the story there. Capital flows are down relative to their peak in the Great Recession, but again, there might be some idiosyncratic aspects with capital markets that might explain that retrenching. On the trade flow side, world trade flows as a percentage of world GDP, they're basically, they went down dramatically at the Great Recession, quickly recovered, and they've been pretty much stagnant since then. Okay, so the process of growth has slowed down. So yes, if you're a commentator and you have an agenda of claiming, there's deglobalization, you're going to be able to pick one or two indicators that are going to show that. But my sense is that when you put all the things together, even if there might be some indications that we might be entering a phase of deglobalization, we certainly have not at this point. I think there's the risk of it happening, but I don't see very clear signs of that having happened.
What about policy? Do you think that we're going to continue after a slowdown to liberalize in the way that you were suggesting on the first phase of hyperglobalization, or it's hard to tell, right? But it does seem like in many places this progress is blocked.
Yes. So I here's where I would agree with Danny. We've touched on that before, which is I do think that it's undeniable that there are growing concerns about a protectionist turn in policy. From the Doha round at the WTO that's been going on for over a decade and very little progress.
Imagine if you get that job.
Huh?
Imagine if you get that job to be one of those ambassadors.
Exactly. We don't have a director general at the WTO since 4 months. Clearly there's been a process of erosion. Not just the institution has basically stopped making progress, but there's been a lot of erosion of its of the architecture on which it was based. So that's particularly worrisome. Even at the regional side, you've also witnessed Brexit firsthand, right? So that it's just taking everything that was happening in the 80s and 90s that I was telling you about before, expansion of the European Union, regional trade integration, and it's basically taking a step back. Yeah. In the US, the USMCA, which is the new NAFTA, it's a small change, small, modification of NAFTA, but if anything, it's a step back. And then let alone this US-China trade war, which, these things are, okay, we're not, WTO regional is like we're not moving forward. We're kind of going back a little bit. But this is an all-out trade war that has increased average tariffs in the US and China to very significant levels we had not seen in decades. So So all this is telling me that obviously there's something happening. Then for a long time, we were thinking, the US-China trade war is just bargaining and they're just sort of taking a strong stance. And this is all at some point we're going to hear they're going to sign a deal and it's all over. But I think we're a little bit past that. And then we're a little bit past that because I think we also understand better that this is not about Trump in the US or, Orban is in Hungary or
Hungary.
Yeah, Hungary or the Brexiters in the UK, that just crazy people that for some reason, not crazy people, but idiosyncratic people that for whatever reason were elected and then they decided to do that. No, we need to understand why they were elected. Okay, and clearly there was growing disillusionment and discontent over globalization. And I think in great part is because of what I mentioned before, which is that trade increased the aggregate income, but it also increased inequality a lot. And a lot of people were not experiencing or did not perceive that they were experiencing the gains from globalization. I think there's a whole set of behavioral issues, if we could, at some point talk about maybe in another session, but on like how people perceive the benefits. And I think very often they might be underestimating the benefits from globalization. But for whatever reason, there's clearly a lot of alienation, a lot of folks that felt that this is actually not working for us. And the worry I have is that if that's what's led us here, I don't see that going away anytime soon. That is, even if globalization, we ride this policy uncertainty somehow, the Biden administration sort of in the US and maybe in the next UK elections, I could imagine a scenario where different political parties are in power and they try to push for things. There's going to be a lot of backlash, because if we are to see an increase in globalization, even if I'm right about robots and things like that, these are technologies that even though they might increase globalization, they're almost certainly going to continue to increase inequality. These are skilled bias, technological change. It's somewhat different, but if anything, it's even worse for unskilled workers. So unless we find ways to better compensate the losers to reduce that alienation, we're going to be in trouble. And you might say, well, why don't we do that? Well, are we, is the Biden administration in the US, for instance, going to be able to do much? Well, it's hard to be optimistic, right? At this point, they won, but they don't control the Senate. So it's very unlikely that in the next 4 years, much is going to change on that front. So, anytime you try to predict the future, you need to be a bit cautious, but that's where I'm really worried. And arguably, I'm much less worried today than I was early in November before the election, where I did think that if Trump won that election, that the situation was going to be really, really worrisome. I'm a little bit less worried, but I do think that the underlying forces are continue to be here.
So one reassuring thing is that trade flows and international exchanges have recovered in spite of all these. You would imagine the lack of mobility would have stopped that, but in fact, trade is pretty much back. Is that not?
Absolutely, yes. So that that is very much related to some of the things that we've already talked about. I think the fact that a big chunk of world trade is associated with a few hundred companies that are large and they have complex global value chains. When the crisis came, things came to a halt, but they didn't reorganize things massively. They didn't sort of start changing suppliers very dramatically. So when things went back to normal, they could sort of scale up again. And this is not just now. I mean, we know that from previous studies that looked at the Great Recession, or previous studies that looked at the Asian financial crisis. These are large shocks, but even when those very large shocks happen, very often we don't see international links getting, being broken up. People sort of they stick together and they try to ride it out. And the reason for that is because it's very complex to set up these value chains. We can think that, the current crisis has led companies to reassess what they should be doing. Maybe we should move out of China and set up company, plants in our own country. But then they crunch numbers and they realize it's very expensive. They need to kind of build new plants, new equipment, and there's such large scale economies that it's very costly to move things around. And I must confess, I mean, you might remember back in 2008, 2009, when the crisis was hitting, you and I were in Oviedo for a ceremony where you gave a very nice speech.
For your praise, to the best economists under 40.
There was the first time I was talking, probably the first time I was talking to the press. So I was all like feeling pretty sure of myself. And I was telling the press, this is gonna be a big shock to the world economy, and we're gonna see depressed trade flows for the next 5-10 years, because it's so hard to create those links. That now that all this crisis is breaking things up, don't expect things to kind of reappear like super quickly, because firms are going to have to find new suppliers. It's going to take time, and it's going to be a slow recovery. And then, 6 months later, I was looking like a fool because things kind of picked up very quickly. And what I had missed is that firms are not dumb. They realize that resetting this value chain is very costly. So they just held together. If supplier was in trouble, they would extend a line of credit just to keep things alive, so that when things go back to normal, you can scale up. And that's exactly what we saw in the data when looking at micro data. A couple of years later, people started looking at micro data, what we call the extensive margin. The trade links did not move much. It was all an intensive margin, shock down, and then back up. For the current COVID crisis, it's a bit early to tell, but Hacia, who is a Spanish economist, has looked at Spanish data, and it's found again that things have moved back up very quickly because the adjustment has been 95% at the intensive margin. So I do think that it takes very large and persistent shocks to lead to reorganization of production. And not even the Great Recession it was. I think policy shocks that are likely to persist are going to lead to this. But COVID, to me, and especially at this point, it looks like something that in a year, we're out of it for sure.